Are processed foods bad for us? If you're someone who wants more than a simple yes or no answer, someone who appreciates the nuances of life, then this video is for you. Hey folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back. My name is Kat. I'm a licensed registered dietitian nutritionist, and on this channel I like to talk about weight inclusive and weight neutral focused approaches to health, as well as diving into scammy and, in my opinion, unethical nutrition related businesses, products, mostly nutrition related MLMs, and other fear mongering nutrition related claims. We are going to be talking about the various kinds of processing of food, the pros, cons, where there's some positives, negatives, and how that looks like in real life application. So if all that sounds good to you, let's go. Now, in the world of fear mongering, when it comes to nutrition, I would say that the term processed food is a big one. It's a term that I feel like is just kind of thrown around as something to avoid, something to not consume. Now, I talk to people on a daily basis about the application of approaching food in a way that is going to support their physical health while also not harming those other aspects of health that are just as important, like mental well-being, social well-being, emotional well-being, and in a way that is doing that sustainably. There is a lot of confusion about nutrition, and I hope that this video gives a little bit more clarity, though at the same time there is a lot of nuance when it comes to talking about nutrition in general, and especially when talking about processed food. Now, I was talking to a group, I actually gave a presentation regarding this situation, and it made me kind of think about how when we approach food, seeing something as all or nothing, good or bad, that's really like a elementary level kind of approach. When we're in elementary school, things are taught as more of like a yes or no kind of thing. But as we grow older, we find that the world has nuance. The world is not always good or bad. There's a whole spectrum of things going on. And it is that nuance, that spectrum, that we really need to see nutrition on in order for it to be sustainable. Because in practice especially, but also in research, what I have seen is the all or nothing kind of approaches that aren't sustainable and that often lead to not so great outcomes, right? So people will have this kind of extreme restriction, and then something will trigger the loss of that restriction, and then consumption goes in the opposite direction. This kind of consumption that just doesn't help support their physical health. It's this like dieting cycle and this pendulum swing. Now, in order to see the nuances within nutrition, that is a skill, and it is absolutely a skill that can be built, but it is built through reps of actions, of practices. Now, this is really where nutrition coaching comes into play. Sometimes people think that being a registered dietitian, we're going to give like a meal plan or a list of like foods to focus on, and while that might be part of that specific person's plan, for me at least, my goal is to build skills in order to approach food with that nuance. And so specifically, I lay it out as being able to approach food with curiosity, compassion, and context. Now, I'm going to come back to that really quick, but I wanted to talk also about food voices. So food voices is something that is discussed in the framework of intuitive eating. Now, they discuss that there are negative food voices and there are also positive food voices. Negative food voices include things like the food police, the nutrition informant, the diet rebel. The nutrition informant and the nutrition police really work together to create this kind of like guilt and shame around eating. It's this kind of voice that's telling you, oh, you shouldn't eat that, or this will happen if you eat that, in a negative bullying kind of way. It really disconnects someone from their body attunement. It's not a beneficial role. Now, on the flip side, for the positive food voices, those include things like the nutrition ally, the food nurturer, the food anthropologist, and the rebel ally. Now, when we can uncouple the food police from the nutrition informant, that nutrition informant can transfer into something that we call the nutrition ally. Now, the nutrition ally is a positive food voice. It helps us to choose foods that are going to support ourselves, our bodies. It's a way of applying body kindness. It aids in making health aligning choices, but without the guilt and without the shame. In health in general, we know from the research that bullying yourself into health does not work. And if it is working for someone, it is going to be short term. And I'm sure there's going to be like someone in the comments bringing up like, I don't know, their experience about how they bullied them into health. But in general, bullying yourself into health is not recommended. It is not sustainable. It is not kind. It does not work. Now, alongside of the nutrition ally, there's also the food anthropologist. And that's one of my favorite food voices to really develop in someone. That really is just a non-judgmental observer. That voice is a way for us to be able to check in and see what we're craving, why we're craving it, why there's some emotional eating maybe going on, just what is going on in a neutral kind of way so that we can approach it in a neutral kind of way to help. That allows us to really put that nutrition ally voice into practice. Now, there are some other positive food voices like the rebel ally. That essentially is a voice that kind of keeps you away from restrictive kind of ways of eating. On the negative food voice side, that is the diet rebel, and that is the one that typically is observed whenever there is that restriction that goes to that kind of binge. It reacts to restrictions in a potentially or with potentially harmful behavior. So sometimes you might see it as positive, but it's going from one not so helpful behavior to another not so helpful behavior, rather than the rebel ally that helps us defend against that restriction in the first place. And then that other positive food voices, the nurturer, that really helps to bring out the compassion piece. The piece that copes with challenges and really helps to disarm any kind of like self-criticism, which is not the same thing as constructive criticism. Constructive criticism there can be growth from that, but destructive kind of criticism. And so going back to kind of the framework that I've developed and I use with my practice is those 3 C's, the curiosity, compassion, and context, being able to approach food with those 3. For the curiosity piece, that's where I see really the food anthropologist voice come in. That allows us to explore food without judgment, asking yourself, what does this food provide? How does it make me feel? What role does it play or can it play in my meal or in my snack? It allows us to experiment with different foods and how it fits for our needs. So that's a curiosity piece that I really see the food anthropologist voice shine. Then there's a compassion piece, and the compassion is really that being kind to yourself with food choices, letting go of rigid rules or the guilt associated with choices. Approaching food with compassion, especially when life gets busy and your food intake maybe doesn't look as what you would prefer, what would be like the best course of action if you had everything kind of taken care of in real life. Like sometimes you just need to eat something, like fed is best. And that's really where I see the food nurturer voice come into play and the rebel ally, because in that time, that compassion is really needed, where sometimes we might feel that pull towards joining a 30-day sugar-free challenge, for example, kind of thing, or anything else that doesn't really focus on skill building and is more about like restriction of something for medical needs. And then there's that 3rd C, which is that context. And that's really where I see the nutrition ally show up. That is not just focusing on these little kind of, food choices here and there, but looking at the bigger picture and how everything fits into that. It's also the context of what is your goal for that meal or snack? Like not long-term goals, this is more of short-term goals. What do you need that food to do for you? Do you need that food to fuel up your muscles to go work out, to go do a long run, or to go do some deadlifts? Or do you need that food goal to be more related to giving you mental energy to be sitting at a desk for the next 5 hours? Like those plates are going to look different. You're looking at the context of the situation. What is your goal? Is it fueling for physical activity? Is it nourishing yourself during a busy day? Or is it simply enjoying the food and enjoying the company? So when we are able to apply curiosity, compassion, and context, that really allows us to see that food neutrality piece. I mean, that essentially, that is my nutrition coaching. That is my kind of philosophy. What I do with nutrition coaching is looking at all of those food voices, kind of assessing how they show up in someone, and then choosing activities that help with those food voices, maybe quieting some of the negative ones down as much as possible and increasing the volume of those positive food voices. Now, how that looks for everyone is going to be different, and there are so many little exercises that we can do to strengthen those positive food voices. So if you were like questioning what nutrition coaching looks like or what the goal of even my online community looks like, it is building up those positive food voices so that we can approach food with curiosity, compassion, and context, which boils down to food neutrality, so that we can be empowered, right? You don't have to feel like you have to follow this kind of meal plan or these good or bad food lists. You are really in the driver's seat and really able to have that trust in yourself and trust in your body and building up the skills in order to have the confidence to do that. I told you at the beginning, if you are here for just like a yes or no question, this is not the video for you. If you are here for the nuance, you're in the right place. So with that all being said, I feel like that is understood in order to go to the next thing that we're talking about, which is the processed food, because so much of that is like how we're going to approach the processed foods. Now, the term processed has become loaded. I feel like there's a lot of misinformation and fear around the word processed food. Whenever there is less information known about something, at least from what I've observed, there seems to be more fear around it. It's kind of the whole like fear of the name only increases fear of the thing itself. Now, processing itself can mean anything from like washing or like cutting fruits and vegetables, or it can mean like the fortification of a food, adding vitamins and minerals. Most of the foods that we consume have experienced some form of processing, whether it is washing spinach before putting it in a bag and then purchasing it from a store and putting it on your plate. That is technically a processed food. Now, just a human thing, we like to put things in categories. And when we're talking about processed food, typically it is described as being in 4 different categories. So we have minimally processed, we have processed culinary ingredients, then we have processed food, and then we have ultra processed foods. Now, for minimally processed foods, those are foods that have undergone minimal processing, hence the name, but they're processed in a way to help make them more convenient. So like salad greens that are already washed, pre-cut fruits or pre-cut vegetables, roasted nuts, frozen fruits and veggies, pasteurized milk even to make it safer. It's cleaning, cutting, freezing, pasteurizing for convenience and also safety. But in general, the food remains very close to its original state. Now, these foods in general, they can provide a wide variety of vitamins, minerals, nutrients overall. And while they are typically very nutrient dense, they're often going to require a little bit more preparation time. Not always, but they can. They might need like some advanced preparation. Beans, for example, you need to cook them. You can't just consume them raw. Now, if you have time for the preparation of that, minimally processed foods, great option. Also, just to rewind really quick, all of those 4 different areas, they blend. There's a spectrum. So sometimes one might fit into like 2 categories, kind of. An example being like an olive oil that can be used in a culinary way, or it can also be seen as more of the minimally processed food that you dip bread in at an Italian restaurant, right? So it can be in multiple categories. And there are some other foods like that, but those are like the general categories. All right, so the next category is a processed culinary ingredients, and those are typically extracted from minimally processed foods and used for baking purposes. So think of like oils, sugar, butter, flour, salt. The processing is going to be like the grinding or the milling, refining, pressing. Now those can really be helpful when added to a meal. It can provide like texture and flavor. They can support the nutrient content and also the enjoyment factor. And you can really experiment with those to change the texture and the taste. Now, the next category is going to be processed foods, and that's going to include things like breads, tortillas, tofu, pasta sauces, canned vegetables, canned fish, cheese. The processing of processed foods in that category is like the canning, the pickling, fermenting, pasteurizing can also be here, and also the addition of preservatives. So they have a longer shelf life. And that might be even with salt. The processed foods in this category generally retain their nutrient qualities, but they may also include some added sugars, added fats, and salt. Now, those foods can really bridge the gap in real life of like the time constraints that you have with like eating a nourishing meal. And I know there's this whole like push and movement to making more of your own like homemade bread and doing the milling of it even like fully from scratch. But not everybody is gonna want to do that. I mean, I have made bread before. I haven't milled the flour, but I've made bread from flour. I've also made my own yogurt, but I often like to purchase yogurt because it's easier and I don't have to worry as much about the food safety side of things because it's taken care of. I am not the one who's like in charge of the food safety around it. You can make your own pickles, you can ferment foods, but again, this is about more of that convenience factor, and they can really be nourishing, practical choices to include as part of your meals. And you can have a meal that includes multiple different things on them. They can include some of the processed foods, some of the minimally processed foods, some of the culinary processed ingredients, but these still provide nutrients and can be very helpful. And I feel like sometimes there's a little bit of guilt for people who feel like they should, and maybe that's just like my perception, but I feel like there is some guilt that some people have that they should be making their own bread, or they should be milling their own flour, making their tortillas, pressing their own tofu, I guess, making their own yogurt. And like sometimes I will make my own pasta sauce, but other times I also will just use one from the jar because it is convenient and it is still nourishing. And there's nothing wrong with either one. And I just don't want anybody to feel guilt like they have to make it on their own. If they want to, sure, go ahead. You can do that. That is great. But these offer so much convenience and can be really still part of a nourishing intake. And really quick also, there is this kind of argument of showing ingredients of foods from like the 80s and then showing other ingredients from foods nowadays and saying how that nowadays there's so many more things added, when in reality like laws have shifted and companies are required to have that transparency in a different way than before. And so there were ingredients that were used prior to those laws that weren't shown on the ingredients list because they weren't required to be. So just because something has a longer ingredients list doesn't mean that it wasn't there before. Now I want to pause here really quick and talk about fortification. And I'm going to read my notes from that so I don't get it wrong. So in the United States, the fortification of breads and cereals, that is regulated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and it's generally voluntary with a few exceptions. So there are some key rules, some guidelines. So first off, the difference between enriched versus fortified. Enriched, that refers to the process of adding back nutrients that were lost during the processing of that food. So that would be something like with refined grains. You are taking away the nutrients in there, so you're going to add some nutrients back. This is like one of the arguments for choosing whole grains, for example. Now, fortification is a little bit different. That is the addition of nutrients that were never originally present in food. It's going to be added as a way to increase the nutrient value of that food. Now, for flour enrichment, the FDA mandates that white enriched flour must have certain nutrients added back, including iron, thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin. Those are B vitamins, and also folic acid. This applies to most refined grain products like white bread, pasta, and certain cereals. Those nutrients are added to replace some of the vitamins and minerals lost during the milling process. Now, specifically regarding the folic acid requirement. So since 1998, the FDA has required the fortification of enriched grains with folic acid to help prevent neural tube defects in newborns. Now, in addition to that, the extra adding of vitamins and minerals at fortification, if they're enriched cereal grains, those are required to be fortified with certain nutrients. For example, that enriched flour fortified fortified with thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron, and folic acid. But for other cereals, ones that aren't the enriched cereal grain ones, those can voluntarily fortify, but they don't have to. So that would include things like whole grain cereals. So cereals made from 100% whole grains, those often retain their nutrients content without needing that enrichment. And so they don't need to have that necessary fortification. And some brands will emphasize that they keep their grains in its whole form without adding extra nutrients. So that might be like a selling point. There's also like organic or more of those like natural cereals, and with their ingredients, it might not fall under that need to provide that fortification. And then some gluten-free cereals, those might be made from alternative grains like millet, amaranth, or sorghum. And so they might not be fortified, as those are typically used in their whole form. The whole goal of fortification is really to help to reduce the need or reduce the just deficiencies of those specific nutrients. And they can be very helpful, very beneficial, especially in children who don't have access to more of like nutrient-rich food for a variety of reasons. So moving on to the fourth category of processed food, that is the ultra-processed foods. Now, these can be things like chips, sodas, instant meals, like fast food style foods, even like MREs. Those are going to be ultra processed. But we all know, or I think we all know, that MREs are often used to keep soldiers fed for long periods of time. They're formulated with many nutrients for that to be. And so that's another example where I can't just say all ultra processed foods are bad or unhelpful. Something like MREs are really important for maintaining the energy nourishment, the energy needs of military service members. The definition more so of like ultra processed foods, those are going to be foods that are more heavily processed. They typically will contain several different ingredients for a variety of reasons, for flavors, like stabilizers, enhancers, sweeteners, colors. The main point is that they have undergone a formulation that is typically not able to be done in like a home kitchen. Now, these are done to create convenience, to provide a longer shelf life, and the processing that can be at the expense of some of the nutrients of the original content. These foods are usually the ones that are higher in added sugars, added fats, and also sodium. Sometimes there is that added kind of fortification, but not always. It's not like a requirement. Basically, the goal is making them more shelf stable and making food more accessible. They're not always going to be nutrient dense, but they can fill a purpose depending on what current needs are. Our ultra processed foods, something that I would recommend for someone to like aim to build their plates with. I don't think any registered dietitian is encouraging people to build their plates, like lay it out with ultra processed food in all of the different areas, or even like requiring that you have one of the areas include that. That is not what is happening. That is not realistic. Sometimes I'll see the argument that like dietitians or people are promoting these kind of foods, we're in big foods pockets, things like that, when in reality, if people are relying more on those foods, there's likely a reason. It's likely related to accessibility. And the furthest thing that we need to do is encourage more guilt or shame around that, because that is just not necessary. Instead, we can work with things that we can add to the meal, even if that is still part of the meal in some way. What can we do to add more variety overall, more variety in those micronutrients? And that is where we're going to see more of those other kind of categories come into play. Now, I think a lot of the fear around processed food, it comes from diet culture. It comes from wellness culture. It's the seeing of foods as good or bad, with like no nuance. Seeing foods as clean or whole. And while I understand there is like sometimes a descriptive need for like whole food, for example, it's not one of the terms or ways of description that I typically use. Basically what I'm saying, like if you use those kind of terms, I'm not mad or anything. This is so much not about individuals. It is about the culture that was created by so many like influencers, coaches, gurus, these kind of things that really promote that idea of good, bad, morality around food, and this kind of hierarchy, when that hierarchy is not needed if we can cultivate that curiosity, compassion, and context. And the impact that the fear around processed foods, the impact of that can lead to frustration, anxiety, guilt, basically disordered eating patterns, disordered eating behaviors. It could trigger an eating disorder, which is very, very scary, but even if it doesn't trigger a full-blown clinical eating disorder, disordered eating habits still aren't something that I would recommend. There's an idea that just because you're having some kind of processed food, it's going to lead to health problems. Nutrition, health, biochemistry, it is so much more complex than that. Overall patterns in a lot of different areas play a larger role. If you've watched my channel, you've likely heard me talk about this many times, but the determinants of health. There are so many factors that come into play when we're talking about what the health outcomes are. Really, the benefits of processed food, there are going to be some benefits, as with any kind of way of seeing nuance. The convenience factor, they can really help make nourishing options more accessible for many people, especially for those with limited resources who maybe can't always purchase or process on their own those minimally processed foods. It can provide food security, having those foods that can last a little bit longer on the shelf, reducing some food waste and increasing accessibility. And they can also help if somebody is having some deficiencies in some areas, the iron added, folic acid, iodine, those can all be beneficial. Those can help for people who would struggle with getting those in the first place. As kind of a takeaway, a few takeaway points, there's no need to fear processed food. If you are fearful of something, I would invite you or encourage you to look a little bit more into it, because again, fear of the name only increases fear of the thing itself. Another takeaway is kind of to look at the overall pattern and to really build up positive food voices. Those will really help with applying those health supportive actions. And so if we can kind of shift focus on those and on things, foods, and to what we can add and to make our plates more nourishing, that is often going to be more sustainable than this kind of fear and restriction around other foods. If you have any questions about the application of that curiosity, compassion, and context, building up those positive food voices, lowering down those negative food voices, that is something that is the foundation of everything that we do within the Unlock Nutrition and Food Freedom community. That is an $11 a month community that I have, where there are daily prompts to either discuss there or take to your own private journaling. There is weekly focuses or weekly topics that those prompts are related to. There is a monthly challenge that is not related to weight or anything. It is focused on like the weekly themes for that month. There's a monthly seminar, a monthly Ask Me Anything with nutrition. There's a huge resource library, everything from like meal preparation, meal ideas, snack ideas, and also more of the emotional like application side of things, understanding emotional eating, cravings, things of that nature, exercises for building of that body attunement. There's a lot in the resources. There's also weekly recipes that are themed as well. So that is linked down below if you want to check that out. Thank you so much for watching this video, and remember, you can strive for health without subscribing to diet culture. I'll see you later. Bye.